Claire Aston stood at the window of her penthouse apartment, her gaze fixed on the glistening skyline of Chicago as the city stretched out below her. The light from the setting sun reflected off the glass towers, casting long shadows over the streets. The view was breathtaking, as it always was. Soaring glass walls that framed the city like a painting, a reflection of the life she had built from nothing, a life of power, wealth, and isolation. At 35, Claire was everything that most people dreamed of being: a self-made billionaire, the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech startups in the country. The world admired her, a woman who had climbed to the top of the corporate ladder with sharp intelligence and unwavering determination. She had everything money could buy: the penthouse, the cars, the designer clothes, and the endless string of glamorous events where she was the center of attention. Yet, for all her success, there was a hollow emptiness that lingered just beneath the surface, a quiet ache that had only deepened over the years. Claire had long ago learned the art of keeping her emotions locked away, her personal life hidden behind a carefully crafted wall of public perfection. She smiled at the cameras, posed at the right angles, and spoke with confidence. But when the doors of her private world closed behind her, the loneliness crept in like a cold draft. At night, when the city below buzzed with life, Claire often found herself staring at the polished marble countertops of her kitchen, feeling like a ghost in her own home. "Everything I wanted," she whispered to the empty room, and yet nothing at all. Her phone buzzed on the glass coffee table, breaking the silence. Claire's fingers hovered over the screen as she read the name on the display: Luke Carter. Her heart skipped a beat. It was a name she hadn't seen in years, not since the night their marriage had imploded, crashing down in a whirlwind of secrets and unspoken words. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unlocked the screen, her eyes scanning the message. "Dear Claire, I hope this message finds you well. I'm writing to invite you to a special day in my life. I'm getting married to Eleanor next month, and I would love for you to be there to celebrate with us. I know things ended between us on difficult terms, but I truly hope you can attend. It wouldn't feel complete without you. Warm regards." Luke. Claire's chest tightened as she read the words. Luke. She hadn't thought about him in months, maybe years, not beyond the occasional passing memory. Their marriage had been a whirlwind, one full of passion, promise, and a constant undercurrent of tension. He had been her equal in many ways, and at the time, that had been enough. She had loved him fiercely, or so she had convinced herself. But love wasn't enough, not when ambition and careers collided, not when each of them was too consumed by their own goals to see what they were losing. And when it all fell apart, the pain had been like 1,000 cuts, each one sharper than the last. She hadn't seen him since their divorce, and now he was asking her to come to his wedding, to watch him marry someone else. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She had never imagined he would move on so quickly, but in a way she should have known. Luke had always been the kind of man who moved forward, who never lingered in the past. She, on the other hand, had built an empire to escape her own. But deep down, a part of her still wanted to know, why her? Why now? Her eyes flickered back to the glittering skyline. The view from her penthouse had never seemed as distant as it did now. For the first time in a long while, Claire felt a gnawing sense of longing. Not for Luke, but for the life she had lost, the version of herself she had buried under layers of business deals, corporate meetings, and endless social events. The woman who once believed in love, in connection, in the possibility of a future shared with someone who understood her. Could she go? Could she face the man she had once promised to spend her life with? She didn't even know who he was anymore, not the way she used to. Their worlds had changed, and Claire had changed with them. She wasn't the same woman who had stood at the altar, filled with hope. Now, she was a woman who had built her own empire but had sacrificed more than she realized along the way. She had spent so many years convincing herself that wealth was the answer, that success would fill the emptiness. But as the years passed, the more she achieved, the more she realized it wasn't enough. It was a gilded cage, a life that sparkled on the outside but left her yearning for something more meaningful. Her phone buzzed again, dragging her out of her thoughts. This time it was Zoe, her assistant, and one of the few people Claire truly trusted. Zoe had been with her for years, watching as Claire built her empire, always there to offer advice, always there to remind her of the importance of the human side of life. "Claire, don't do it. Don't go to that wedding. You're better off without him." Claire hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen. Zoe was right, of course. She had everything she needed. She didn't need to revisit her past. But there was a small voice inside her, a whisper of doubt that urged her to go, to find closure, to face the man who had once been her everything. Claire took a deep breath and typed out a response. "I'll be there." As she hit send, she felt a strange sense of finality. It was as if she had just opened a door to a part of her past that she had long since shut away. What was she really seeking? Closure? Revenge? Or something deeper? Something she hadn't been able to admit even to herself. The evening sun dipped below the horizon, and the city lights flickered on, casting their glow across the glass walls of her penthouse. Claire looked out over the city once more, a mix of uncertainty and anticipation brewing inside her. This wedding would change everything. Whether she was ready for it or not, her past was about to collide with her present. The morning of the wedding arrived in a blur of nerves and anticipation. Claire stood in front of her bedroom mirror, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of Chicago's skyline behind her. The city, as always, seemed like another world, a glittering oasis of wealth and ambition. She had never felt more disconnected from it, though. She ran a hand over the fabric of her dress, an elegant, simple black gown. It wasn't flashy, not like the ones she often wore to high-profile galas, but it was perfect for a wedding. The kind of understated elegance she hoped would keep her from drawing too much attention to herself. Her fingers brushed against the sleek, cool fabric, a faint sense of unease creeping up her spine. The doorbell rang, cutting through the stillness of her thoughts. Claire turned away from the mirror and walked towards the door, pulling it open to find her assistant, Zoe, standing in the hallway, holding a small bouquet of white lilies. "You look amazing," Zoe said, a warm smile on her face. But there was something in her eyes, a softness, almost like pity, that Claire didn't quite know how to handle. "Thanks," Claire murmured, accepting the bouquet. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." She shook her head, more to herself than to Zoe. "You don't have to do this, you know," Zoe said, stepping inside and placing her purse on the couch. "You've come so far since that time. You don't need to look back." Claire nodded slowly, but the words didn't comfort her as they once might have. In fact, they left her with a strange, hollow feeling in the pit of her stomach. She did need to look back, though, didn't she? This wasn't about Luke. This wasn't about his marriage. No, this was about something far more personal, about the woman she used to be, the one who had loved without reservation, without fear. "I know," Claire said softly, "but I need to understand why I can't let him go." The truth slipped out more easily than she had expected. The words felt like a confession, a long-held secret that had somehow escaped from the very corners of her heart. Zoe paused, her expression unreadable for a moment, before she took a deep breath and placed a hand on Claire's shoulder. "You'll be okay. Just remember who you are now. Don't let him—" Zoe hesitated, clearly searching for the right words. "Don't let him undo the work you've done." Claire smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'll try." As Claire turned away to grab her purse, she noticed the tension in her own shoulders, the tightness in her chest. She hadn't felt this way in a long time. Vulnerable, unsure. The sleek, polished world she had built felt less like her own today than it ever had. Was it Luke that caused this? Or was it just the nature of returning to a past she had left behind? She shook the thought away, forcing herself to focus. She had come too far to back down now. The drive to the wedding venue was silent. Zoe sat beside her, a steady presence in the passenger seat, but neither of them spoke. Claire's mind raced as the car glided through the streets, the familiar hum of the city somehow louder in her ears than usual. The venue was an old estate, sprawling and opulent, tucked away just outside the city in one of those neighborhoods where the homes felt like miniature palaces. It was the kind of place that reminded Claire of everything she had worked for, everything she had gained, but also everything that had slipped away in the process. When they arrived, Claire felt an immediate wave of unease. The guests, already milling about in the grand garden, were dressed to the nines, their laughter and light chatter floating through the air. But there was no warmth in the atmosphere for Claire, only cold, calculating eyes that had seen her rise, but had never fully embraced her. She was just another face in a sea of wealth. As Claire and Zoe walked toward the entrance, Claire's eyes scanned the crowd. It was then that she saw him. Luke. He was standing across the garden, speaking with a few guests, his back to her. And even from this distance, even through the veil of unfamiliar faces and the soft hum of music, Claire could feel the magnetic pull of him, like a force of nature she couldn't escape. His broad shoulders, his dark hair, his posture, all of it was so familiar it hurt. His life had gone on without her, just as she had expected. Yet, seeing him again made everything seem like it was still frozen in time. He hadn't changed, at least not in the ways that mattered. But there was something else, something that caught her attention even before her eyes could fully focus on him. He was smiling, not the smile she remembered, not the easy grin that had always melted her heart, but a smile that seemed forced. There was something hollow behind it, something she couldn't quite place. Claire's heart skipped, but she quickly pushed the feeling aside. He had moved on. This was his new life, his new beginning. And yet, the ache in her chest remained, gnawing at her. Maybe she wasn't ready for this. Not like this. The ceremony was about to begin, and the guests were slowly gathering, moving toward the white tent set up on the expansive lawn. Claire followed Zoe toward the front, the weight of the moment settling heavily on her. The air felt thick with the unspoken. She had never expected to be here, standing in the middle of Luke's world again. To see him with another woman, to witness him marry someone who, from the looks of it, was everything Claire was not. As Claire took her seat, her gaze shifted once more toward Luke, and that's when she saw it. The child. A little boy, not more than 6 years old, with dark hair and wide brown eyes. He was standing beside Eleanor, Luke's fiancée, smiling up at her as if he belonged in this world. But it wasn't just the boy's smile that caught Claire's attention. It was his face. He looked exactly like Luke. A jolt of recognition hit Claire like a punch to the gut. She hadn't been prepared for this. A child? Luke had a child? And why had no one, least of all Luke, ever mentioned him? Claire's breath caught. The puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place, but she wasn't sure she was ready to solve this particular mystery. But as the music began to play and the ceremony started, all she could do was stare at the boy, wondering what his presence meant for her, what it meant for Luke. Claire sat rigidly in her seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The quiet murmur of the guests faded into the background as her attention remained fixed on the boy. The tiny figure stood just beside Eleanor, Luke's fiancée, with a serenity that seemed far too mature for someone so young. His large dark eyes looked up at Eleanor, and his smile was soft, innocent. Yet every time his gaze shifted toward Luke, a quiet connection sparked between them, as though they shared an unspoken bond, one that Claire couldn't quite understand. There was no mistaking it. The boy looked exactly like Luke. Same dark hair, same sharp jawline, even the same expressive eyes. The realization hit Claire like a wave, sudden and overwhelming. This child, this little boy who seemed so perfectly placed in the center of the ceremony, was Luke's, but why had no one mentioned him before? As the guests began to settle into their seats and the soft notes of the wedding march began to play, Claire's mind raced. She forced herself to focus on the ceremony unfolding before her, but her thoughts kept returning to the boy. She hadn't expected this new development, this complication that threatened to throw everything off balance. 1,000 questions raced through her mind. Why hadn't Luke told her about the child? Why was he only now making an appearance at his wedding? And, perhaps most perplexingly, why did it feel like the boy was more important than Claire herself? The officiant's voice broke through her thoughts. "We are gathered here today to celebrate the union of Luke Carter and Eleanor Green." The words were distant, hollow even. Claire tried to focus on the vows being exchanged, on the promises that seemed so easy for them to make, but her mind kept drifting back to that boy, and to Luke. The Luke she had once known was full of ambition, passion, and perhaps too much pride. But the man standing before her now, dressed in a crisp white suit, smiling as he looked at Eleanor, felt like a stranger. He looked content, sure of himself in ways that Claire hadn't seen in years. Was it the child that had made him change, or was this just the version of Luke she never allowed herself to see? When the vows ended and the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Claire forced herself to clap, as did the other guests, offering polite smiles and cheers. But her hands felt stiff, awkward, as though her body had forgotten how to participate in this charade. She wasn't ready to be here, wasn't ready to accept the version of Luke that had moved on without her. As the guests mingled, congratulating the newlyweds, Claire stood, momentarily lost in the crowd. She needed air, space, something to clear the confusion fogging her mind. She started to move toward the back of the garden, but before she could make it past the ornate pillars that lined the ceremony area, she heard a voice behind her. "Claire." It was Luke. She turned slowly, her heart skipping a beat at the sound of his voice. There he stood, looking as polished and perfect as he had when they were married. His hair was slightly tousled, his eyes still that same shade of brown she had once gotten lost in. He was older now, of course, more refined, but still unmistakably the man she had loved. For a moment neither of them said anything. The silence between them felt heavy, a chasm of unspoken words that neither was ready to bridge. Then Luke spoke again, his voice quieter now, more sincere. "You look stunning," he said, a small, rueful smile curving on his lips. Claire couldn't find the words to respond right away. She had rehearsed her responses in her head before arriving. What she would say when she saw him, what would be appropriate. But now, face to face with him, she felt nothing but a rush of memories, of pain, and of something else. Something that wasn't resentment or hatred, but something deeper. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "You look happy," she added, glancing toward Eleanor, who was laughing with some of the guests nearby. "I am," Luke replied, his eyes softening as he watched his new wife. "I'm finally at peace, Claire." Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. At peace. She wanted to believe him, but something about his words felt empty, like a well-crafted lie designed to make everyone around him believe he had everything he ever wanted. But deep down she wondered if he truly had found peace, or if the past they shared still haunted him, as it haunted her. The silence stretched between them again, and Claire felt the weight of 1,000 questions pressing down on her chest. But it was the boy, Thomas, that kept her tethered to the moment, the little boy with the wide eyes, who looked at Luke with such innocent affection. Claire cleared her throat. "And, who's that little one?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though her heart was beating faster now. Luke's smile faltered for a brief second before he masked it with a guarded expression. He hesitated, as if debating whether to share this piece of information with her. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more reserved. "His name is Thomas," he said, his gaze flicking toward the boy, who was now playing with some other children nearby. "He's my son." Claire's breath caught in her throat. The words hung in the air like an anchor, pulling her deeper into a sea of confusion. His son? A child? Luke had a child? "You never mentioned him before," Claire said, unable to mask the edge in her voice. "I know," Luke replied, his expression shifting, as if he regretted the secrecy. "It wasn't the right time, but he's a big part of my life now." His eyes softened as he watched Thomas, his smile full of pride. Claire's mind spun as she took in the sight of Luke gazing at Thomas. The boy was his, there was no denying that. But the question burned in her mind. Why didn't he tell me? She swallowed hard, trying to regain some composure. I didn't know," she said, her voice faltering. "Why didn't you tell me about him, Luke?" Luke's expression darkened slightly, his gaze shifting to the ground. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said quietly. "Not like this. Not after everything we went through." Claire felt the sting of his words, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't the same woman she had been when they'd first met. She had learned to mask the hurt, to carry it with her like a shield. But the truth, this new layer of their past, was more than she had expected. She had come here for closure, but now she was more tangled in the past than ever before. "Do you love him?" Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper, though the question felt as though it had been building for years. Luke's eyes met hers, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the smile faded from his face. He seemed to struggle with the answer, his expression shifting between guilt and a quiet, painful honesty. "I do," he said simply. "I love him, Claire, more than I ever thought possible." And just like that, everything changed. The boy was no longer just a surprise. He was the key to a new chapter in Luke's life, one that Claire would never be part of. The realization struck her harder than anything else that day. And yet she couldn't tear herself away. There was still a part of her, somewhere deep inside, that wanted to understand, wanted to know how this story would end. Claire stood frozen as Luke's words hung in the air, a quiet confession that reverberated through her. "I love him." She couldn't shake the image of Luke gazing down at Thomas, his face soft with affection, the bond between them undeniable. It wasn't just a child he was talking about. It was the life he had now, the future he was building without her. The ache inside her chest deepened, a pang of loss sharper than she anticipated. Claire wasn't sure whether it was the realization of what Luke had moved on to, or the crushing sense that she was being left behind again. "Why now, Luke?" Her voice was barely audible, but the question felt like it needed to be asked. "Why didn't you tell me about him before? We shared everything once." Luke's eyes darkened as he glanced away, his jaw tightening. It was clear the topic made him uncomfortable, but Claire couldn't stop herself. She needed to know, needed to understand what had happened. He sighed, running a hand through his hair before meeting her gaze again. It wasn't just a secret about Thomas, he said softly. "There was a lot more I didn't tell you. I wasn't honest with you, Claire. Not about my fears, not about why we fell apart." The words hit Claire harder than any of the silent years between them. For a long time she had convinced herself that it had been her fault, that her ambition, her focus on work, had driven Luke away. But hearing it from him, he hadn't been honest with her, made her question everything she thought she knew about their marriage. "You kept secrets from me?" she whispered, her voice trembling just slightly. "And you never thought I deserved to know?" Luke's face softened, and there was an edge of guilt in his expression. "I didn't know how to tell you. You were always so driven, so focused. I was afraid if I told you the truth, you'd walk away even faster." Claire inhaled sharply. His words stung, but they also opened up a space inside her, one where the pain of their past marriage could finally be examined, one that had been buried for too long beneath the weight of her success. Driven. That was how he saw her. But had she really been so wrapped up in herself that she missed the cracks in their relationship? "I was afraid too, Luke," she admitted, her voice small but steady. "Afraid I wasn't enough for you, that my work would always come first. And maybe it did. But you left too. You never said anything. You just let it fall apart." Luke looked away, clearly wrestling with his own thoughts. The wedding, the guests, the new life he had built without her. None of it seemed to matter now, not in this moment of raw honesty between them. "You're right," he said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't fight for us. I was too afraid to admit that I needed you, that I couldn't do it alone. And now I have a son, Claire. I've learned things I wish I'd understood sooner." Claire's eyes stung, but she refused to let the tears fall. She wasn't that woman anymore, the woman who would let her emotions control her. She was different now, stronger, more certain of who she was and where she was headed. But it didn't stop the pain from creeping in, like an old wound reopening. "I'm glad you're happy, Luke," she said, her voice steady even though her heart felt anything but. "Really, I am. But you're right about one thing. We didn't fight for us. And I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that this—" She gestured to the wedding around them, to the life Luke had built with Eleanor, to the child who had become the center of his world. "This is something I can be part of." Luke's face fell, and for the first time since she arrived, Claire saw something that resembled regret flash in his eyes. "Claire, I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I was doing the right thing by protecting you from all of this. But I see now that I only made it worse." There was a long pause between them, one that stretched thin and fragile. Claire could feel the weight of the years, the unspoken words, the hurt they had buried so deep beneath their ambition and pride. But there was no going back. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. "I need to go," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. She turned away before Luke could say anything else, before she allowed herself to change her mind. The truth was there, hanging in the air, and Claire knew it was time to walk away. As she made her way toward the exit of the garden, her thoughts swirling like a storm, Claire found herself unable to breathe. She had loved Luke, loved him with everything she had. But somewhere along the way, she had stopped being his and had become someone else, someone who no longer belonged in this life, no longer belonged in the world he had created with Eleanor and Thomas. She was halfway across the lawn when she heard a voice calling her name. "Claire!" It wasn't Luke this time, it was Eleanor. Claire paused, her hand resting on the wrought iron gate at the edge of the property. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest as Eleanor approached, her heels clicking sharply against the stone pathway. I wanted to talk to you," Eleanor said, her voice softer than Claire had expected. I know this must be difficult for you. For both of you. Claire raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to say. Difficult? She echoed. I think difficult is an understatement. Eleanor glanced toward the reception tent, where the sound of laughter and music floated through the air. I didn't mean it like that, she said quickly, but I know it must be hard seeing Luke with me, and with Thomas. It's not the way you probably imagined your life would turn out, I'm sure. Claire's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, Eleanor sounded sincere, genuinely concerned even. She was the woman who had taken Luke's heart, who had built a life with him while Claire had been left to pick up the pieces of her own world. But, Eleanor continued, her voice soft but unwavering, I wanted you to know that Thomas has been the best thing that's ever happened to Luke. He's brought him peace, Claire. More than you and I ever could. Claire stared at her, her chest tightening. The weight of the woman's words settled deep within her, but there was something else there too, an undercurrent that felt almost like a challenge. I know, Claire said, her voice steady, though her insides churned with unspoken emotions. I see that now. Eleanor smiled faintly, as if she had won some silent victory, before offering Claire a final, knowing glance. I just wanted you to understand, and to know that you don't have to hold on to the past anymore. It's over. And just like that, Eleanor turned and walked back toward the reception, her head held high, the perfect picture of someone who had everything Claire thought she had once wanted. Claire stood there for a moment longer, her gaze lingering on the woman who now occupied the space Claire had once held in Luke's life. She wasn't angry, not anymore, but there was a quiet sadness, a resignation that seeped through her as she realized she was no longer part of that world. For the first time in years, Claire felt something shift inside her, something that wasn't about power or success or wealth. It was about letting go. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start something new. The drive back to the city was almost silent. The hum of the engine filled the car, but Claire's thoughts were a tangled mess of emotions and memories she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Zoe, sitting in the passenger seat, didn't speak either, sensing the weight of Claire's silence. Claire had never been good at letting go. Whether it was her career, her ambitions, or the relationships that had come and gone, she had always held on tight, as though letting go would mean losing everything she had worked so hard to build. But today had been different. She had walked into Luke's world again, and in doing so had realized just how much of herself she had left behind in the process. She had watched him marry someone else, someone who seemed to complete the picture he had crafted for himself, his life now full of love, family, and happiness, while Claire felt like an outsider looking in. And yet, there was something else, something deeper that Claire hadn't quite understood until Eleanor had spoken to her. It wasn't just the sense of loss that haunted her, but the quiet realization that Luke's life had moved forward, while hers had been stuck, like a beautiful painting gathering dust in the back of a gallery. Zoe glanced at her out of the corner of her eye, but Claire didn't acknowledge her. She was too lost in the thought of what had just happened, what she had learned, and what she would do with all of it. The weight of Eleanor's words kept echoing in her mind. It's over. But was it? Claire wasn't so sure. Maybe it was time to face the truth, that maybe she was the one who had been holding on to the past. Maybe it wasn't just about Luke anymore. Maybe it was about her, about the way she had let her fear of vulnerability control her for so long. The next morning, Claire found herself in her office, sitting at her desk, staring out the window at the vast cityscape below. The glass walls of her high-rise office framed the skyline like a painting, just as her penthouse had framed the city the night before. The city was a symbol of everything she had built, and yet it felt less like home with every passing day. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie, and Claire looked down to see a message from Zoe. "Claire, you need to check your email. Something came through. I think you'll want to see it." Sighing, Claire unlocked her phone and opened her email. There was a message from her lawyer, marked urgent. She clicked it open, her stomach tightening with anticipation. The subject line was simple, property inquiry. Her eyes skimmed the message quickly. "Dear Claire, I hope this message finds you well. I've attached some documents regarding the property you've been considering in the outskirts of the city. The owners have reached out and we've been offered a meeting. It might be a good opportunity to discuss further investments or possible developments. Please let me know when you'd like to arrange the meeting." Claire's heart skipped a beat. The property she'd been eyeing for months, her sanctuary, a space to call her own, far away from the corporate world, from the expectations that followed her every step. It was a quiet, secluded place, far from the lights of the city, where she could breathe and find herself again. But as she read the email again, she realized something. She had been holding on to this dream of retreating, of escaping the chaos, not because it was what she truly wanted, but because it was what she thought would fix her. She had wanted a way out, a way to put her past behind her. But now, with everything that had happened, Luke's marriage, the child, Eleanor's words, it felt like a hollow escape. Claire closed her eyes, her fingers hovering over the keys as she contemplated her next move. It wasn't just about finding a new place, a new chapter. It was about facing her own ghosts, letting them go. It was about living again, not hiding. Her phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. This time it was a call from Richard, her business mentor. He had been in her life longer than Zoe had, guiding her through the early years of her company's rise. He was one of the few people she trusted, someone who always told her the truth, whether she wanted to hear it or not. "Richard," Claire answered, trying to sound composed, though she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the act. "What's going on? You're still in one piece, I take it?" Richard's voice was warm, but there was an edge of concern beneath his words. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I know that wedding didn't go as planned." Claire exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair, feeling the weight of his words. It didn't. "I know you, Claire," Richard continued, "and I know when you're running from something. You've done it before. You bury yourself in work, in the next big deal, in the next property. But that's not going to solve this one." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to hear this. Not now. But Richard was right. She had always run, always buried herself in the work that would distract her from the emotions she couldn't quite handle. "I'm not running," she replied, her voice firm, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. "I'm just figuring things out." "Figuring things out? Or avoiding them?" Richard's tone softened, but the challenge was clear. "Claire, you're a strong woman, and you've built something incredible. But if you don't deal with what's haunting you, what's been holding you back, none of that will matter. You can have all the wealth in the world, but if you don't face your own demons, you'll always be empty inside." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She was used to being in control, used to navigating through life with a plan, with precision. But now the pieces of her life felt scattered, broken in places she couldn't reach. "I don't know where to start," she whispered, more to herself than to Richard. "There's no one right way to do it, Claire," he said gently. "But the first step is the hardest. You have to face the truth, about yourself, about Luke, about everything." Claire swallowed hard. The weight of his words pressed down on her, but she couldn't deny that they were the truth. She had been hiding behind her success for far too long. "Maybe it's time to stop running," she said softly. And with that, something inside her shifted. She didn't have all the answers, and she wasn't sure where this journey would take her. But she knew one thing for certain. It was time to finally face the life she had left behind, and the life she still had a chance to build. The days after the wedding passed in a blur. Claire tried to keep her usual routine, throwing herself into meetings and project deadlines, as if doing so would somehow erase the feelings that had flooded her during the ceremony. But every time her mind wandered, it was back to the same question. What now? She had spent years building this empire, this carefully constructed life of wealth and power, and yet it felt like everything had shifted in an instant. Luke's wedding had cracked something wide open, something she didn't even realize was there. The truth about Thomas, the boy who looked like Luke and seemed to embody everything Claire had once wanted, left her feeling lost. But it wasn't just the revelation about the child, it was the way everything had unfolded. The life Luke had built without her, the marriage, the family. She had once believed they would be the ones to write their future together. But here they were, separated by more than just years. Now Claire faced the truth. The life she had been so focused on was not her own. She leaned back in her office chair, staring out the glass walls at the city sprawling below. The skyline had always been a source of pride, a symbol of her success. But today, it felt like a cage. The soft hum of the air conditioning seemed louder in the quiet, and her reflection in the glass stared back at her like a stranger. She was still the CEO of a thriving company, still at the top of her game, but something was missing. Her phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. It was a text from Zoe. "Can we talk? I think you need to hear this." Claire's brow furrowed. She hadn't expected Zoe to be so persistent after the wedding. Zoe had been the one who warned her against attending, but even more than that, Zoe had been her anchor, always telling her when to hold firm, when to walk away. Claire trusted her implicitly, so when Zoe said she needed to talk, Claire knew it was serious. She typed back quickly, "Come up to the office." Zoe was in Claire's office within minutes, her expression serious, eyes scanning the room as she took a seat across from Claire. "I didn't want to say anything earlier, but I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about running. And you're right." Claire leaned forward, suddenly intrigued. "What do you mean? Running from what?" Zoe sighed, her fingers tapping nervously against the desk. "I've been talking to some people. Well, more like overhearing conversations if we're being honest. And I heard something that might be relevant. It's about Luke." Claire's stomach dropped. "What about Luke?" Zoe hesitated before speaking again, her voice quieter. "It's about Thomas. I didn't want to bring it up, but I think you need to know. There's something you don't know about the whole situation." Claire's heart started to race. "What are you saying?" Zoe looked directly at Claire now, her eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and something else, something Claire couldn't quite place. "Luke didn't just get married for love, Claire. There's more to it. Eleanor, she has her own agenda. And Thomas, well, he might not be exactly who you think he is." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Claire felt a jolt of shock, followed by a wave of confusion. "What do you mean? What do you know about Thomas?" Zoe leaned forward. "I'm not sure of all the details, but it looks like Eleanor's been manipulating the situation. She knows how much Luke cares about his reputation, how he'd do anything to preserve his image. And Thomas? Well, he might not even be Luke's biological son. There's something off about the whole story. I'm telling you, there's more here than meets the eye." Claire's pulse quickened, her thoughts spiraling. Luke had been so adamant that Thomas was his son. He had looked at the boy with such love, such certainty. But now Zoe's words made Claire question everything she had seen, everything she thought she knew. "I need to know more," Claire said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "If there's something I don't know, I need to hear it." Zoe hesitated again. It's a bit complicated, but I can help you find out. I know a few people who could dig deeper. Do it, Claire said, cutting her off before Zoe could protest. I need answers. Later that evening, Claire found herself at a small upscale restaurant, her fingers nervously tapping the rim of her wineglass. She had agreed to meet with someone from her past, someone who might be able to shed light on the situation. Ethan Reed, an investigative journalist she had once known, was sitting across from her now, his piercing blue eyes watching her carefully. Ethan had always been the type of man who never asked questions he didn't already have answers to. He was sharp, resourceful, and more than capable of uncovering the truth, no matter how buried it was. I've been hearing some rumors about Luke, Claire said, her voice low as she took a sip of wine, trying to keep her composure. About Thomas, his son. I need to know what's really going on. Ethan's lips twitched into a faint smile. I figured that's why you asked to meet. You don't usually let curiosity get the best of you, Claire. What's so different now? She met his gaze, trying not to show the vulnerability she felt. I need to know the truth about Luke, about Eleanor, and about Thomas. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed her words. All right, he said finally. I'll see what I can dig up. But you need to be prepared for what you might find. Sometimes the truth has a way of changing everything, Claire. And once you go down that path, you won't be able to go back. Claire nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever Ethan would uncover, but she knew she had to face the truth. She had spent too long hiding from it, letting the ghosts of her past control her. She couldn't let that happen anymore. Ethan's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen before meeting her eyes again. I'll start tomorrow. I'll let you know what I find. Claire stood, her mind already racing ahead. She had taken the first step. She had asked for the truth. Now she would have to face it, no matter what it might reveal. As she walked out of the restaurant and into the cool evening air, Claire felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time she felt a sense of clarity. She was done running from her past. It was time to face it head on, and whatever the truth turned out to be, Claire knew she had the strength to handle it. Claire stood at the edge of the city, looking at the skyline that had once defined her. It was still beautiful, but it was no longer the dream. The real question now was what came next, and whether the truth would set her free or leave her shattered. The night felt colder than it should have. Claire stood in front of her floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city's skyline, the lights below a hazy blur in the distance. The rhythmic hum of the city never failed to lull her into a sense of calm, but tonight it only served to highlight the isolation she felt inside. Everything had changed in the days since the wedding, and the unease gnawing at her hadn't lessened. If anything, it had intensified. She was waiting for Ethan's call, the one she'd been both anticipating and dreading. He had promised to dig into Luke's life, into the truth about Thomas, and she had no idea what she was about to learn. A part of her wanted to believe that everything was just a misunderstanding, that Thomas truly was Luke's child, and that Luke was the same man she had once known. But a more substantial part of her, the part that had learned to trust only herself, the part that had learned not to let her emotions get in the way, was terrified of what the truth might be. As her phone buzzed, her heart jumped in her chest. She picked it up quickly, her fingers cold against the screen. Ethan Reed, I have something. We need to talk. Claire didn't hesitate. She dialed his number immediately. Claire, Ethan answered after a single ring, his voice smooth and serious. I found something. I'm not sure you're going to like it. Her throat tightened. What did you find? Ethan paused for a moment, and Claire could hear the faint rustling of papers on his end. She could almost imagine him pacing back and forth, thinking carefully about how to break the news. "Thomas isn't Luke's son," Ethan said finally, the words landing like a heavy blow. Claire's chest constricted, and her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" "I mean, he's not his biological child," Ethan said. "But that's not the full story. Luke is still involved in Thomas's life, but it's not for the reasons you think. Thomas was actually adopted, but the truth about his biological father is murkier than I thought. Eleanor's involved in this somehow, and there's more to the situation than just a simple family story." Claire felt the world around her spin. She sank into the chair beside her desk, her hands gripping the armrests as if that would somehow steady her. "You're saying Eleanor—" "Eleanor had a role in this, yes," Ethan interrupted. "But there's something else. Luke and Eleanor aren't just connected through Thomas. There's a business deal behind all of this, Claire. A very lucrative one. One that could explain why Luke and Eleanor were so eager to make their relationship look perfect. I'm still digging into the specifics, but it's clear that this wasn't just about love. It never was." Claire felt the blood drain from her face. Her mind raced as she tried to process what Ethan was saying. A business deal? She had always known that wealth and relationships were often intertwined in the world she moved in. But this? This felt like a betrayal of everything she had thought they shared. "You're telling me this whole marriage and this family was orchestrated?" Claire asked, her voice trembling, though she tried to keep her tone steady. "For money?" "It looks that way. I'm still confirming some of the finer details, but it's starting to make sense. Thomas was adopted as part of a larger plan. Eleanor and Luke's marriage was more about securing a future for both of them in the business world than it was about building a family." Claire didn't know how to feel. Anger, disbelief, confusion, everything tangled together in a knot deep in her chest. The life Luke had built, the one he had invited her into, had been a lie. It wasn't just the child or the marriage, it was the foundation of everything, the why behind it all. Her thoughts flashed to the boy, Thomas, and how much he resembled Luke, the boy who had seemed so innocent, so loved. Claire had assumed that his presence meant something genuine in Luke's life, but now she wasn't so sure. Was Thomas just a pawn in a much bigger game? "How sure are you?" Claire's voice was tight, her heart racing in her chest. "Is this really what's happening?" "I've spoken to a few people who are familiar with the situation," Ethan replied carefully. "There's a lot more at play here than just a child. The adoption was part of the deal, and Luke and Eleanor's marriage is essentially a cover-up. But like I said, I'm still piecing it together. This isn't the kind of thing that's easy to prove on paper. People like Luke and Eleanor don't leave fingerprints. But trust me, I'm onto something big." A cold shiver ran through Claire's veins. The last thing she had ever expected was to find herself unraveling the life of a man she once loved. The version of Luke she had known seemed so far removed from this world of business deals and manipulations. But in a way, she had known it all along. The marriage, the child, it had all felt too perfect, too planned. Claire had always wondered if Luke had truly moved on, but now it seemed like his life had been calculated from the start. "Are you sure?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't some mistake? Some misunderstanding?" Ethan was quiet for a beat before responding. "I wish I could say it was, but no. This is what I'm seeing. I'll keep digging, Claire. But you need to be prepared. Whatever you thought about Luke, whatever you thought about his life with Eleanor, there's more to it than you know." Claire's heart twisted in her chest. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the pain of the words, the weight of the truth sinking in. She had come to this wedding seeking closure, hoping to finally let go of the past. But instead, she had uncovered something far more complicated. Luke's life wasn't the one she had imagined. It wasn't the one she had hoped for. And now, Claire had to make a choice. A choice to walk away and never look back, or to face the reality of what she had learned and let it change everything. The next morning, Claire found herself standing in front of the mirror, dressed for a meeting with her investors. Her reflection stared back at her, but for the first time in years, she didn't recognize the woman looking at her. The power, the success, it all seemed hollow now. What had once been a source of pride had become a reminder of everything she had given up. She had built her career on ambition and control, but now she wasn't so sure it was enough. Her phone buzzed on the bathroom counter. Another message from Ethan. "I found more. Meet me this afternoon. We need to talk in person." Claire's heart skipped a beat. She was closer to the truth than she had ever been before. But as she reached for her phone, she knew that once she stepped into this next chapter, there would be no turning back. Claire's hands trembled as she set her phone down on the marble countertop. Ethan's message lingered in her mind, gnawing at her. She had spent so many years building a life on control, on managing her empire, making decisions with precision, and walking away from anything that didn't serve her vision. But the revelation about Luke, about Eleanor, about Thomas, none of it fit into the life she had so carefully constructed. She had thought she was prepared for everything. After all, Claire Aston didn't allow herself to be caught off guard. But the more she uncovered, the more she felt like a stranger in her own world. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet of her office, marking the minutes that seemed to stretch endlessly. She had a meeting in less than an hour, but somehow it felt insignificant. The meetings, the deals, the presentations, it all seemed so far away from the raw truth that was slowly unraveling around her. Taking a deep breath, Claire grabbed her coat and headed out the door. She didn't know what she was walking into with Ethan, but for the first time in years, she felt a strange sense of urgency. It wasn't about the wealth or the power anymore. It was about the truth, about finally understanding what had really happened with Luke. She needed closure. She needed to know if everything she had believed in, everything she had sacrificed, was built on a lie. Ethan's office was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, the kind of place that didn't advertise its presence to the world. Claire had only been there once before, years ago, when she'd needed his expertise on a particularly sensitive matter involving a business rival. Now, as she stepped inside, the dim lighting and minimalist decor felt like a reflection of the chaos swirling inside her mind. Ethan stood near the window, his back to her, as though he had been waiting for this moment too. He turned around when he heard her footsteps, his usual easy demeanor replaced by something more serious, more guarded. "Claire," he said, offering a nod of acknowledgement. "Thanks for coming." She didn't reply at first, her eyes scanning his office. She had always respected Ethan, his sharp mind, his uncanny ability to find answers to difficult questions. But today, it was different. She wasn't sure if she wanted the answers he had to give. "What do you have for me?" Claire's voice was steady, but her chest felt tight, as though she were preparing for a battle she wasn't sure she would win. Ethan gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit down. You might want to hear this all at once." Claire complied, taking a seat and folding her arms across her chest. She wanted to appear calm, detached, but she could feel her pulse quickening. The truth about Luke had been slowly revealing itself, layer by layer, and now she was about to hear the final piece of the puzzle. Ethan pulled out a folder from his desk drawer and placed it on the table in front of her. "I've been digging, like I promised, and I found out something that might surprise you. Or maybe it won't." He paused, his fingers tapping lightly on the folder. Luke isn't just involved with Eleanor for business, Claire. There's a deeper connection between them. They're not just partners in marriage, they're partners in something bigger. And it involves a lot more than just Thomas. Claire's heart skipped. What are you saying? What is it? Ethan opened the folder, revealing a series of documents and photographs, some of which Claire recognized from public records, but others were new. Luke and Eleanor have been involved in a covert real estate development project, one that's tied to the political scene here in Chicago, a major development. And Thomas? He glanced at her, eyes hardening. He's not just their adopted son. He's the key to a much bigger game. Claire blinked, trying to absorb the weight of his words. You're telling me they used a child as part of some business deal? I'm not saying it was just about Thomas. But yes, Ethan replied, his voice unwavering. The adoption was part of a strategy to gain influence in the city. The media loves a perfect family, Claire. And for Luke and Eleanor, this was a way to solidify their public image while securing a huge financial stake in a development project that's set to reshape the city. Thomas was brought in as a symbol, a way to humanize their business dealings. Claire's head spun. The child, Thomas, had always felt like the missing piece of the puzzle, but not like this. He had been used, not just as a symbol of their family, but as a pawn in a much larger scheme. This is insane, Claire whispered, her breath shaky. All this time I thought it was about love, about a family. But this is manipulation. Ethan's gaze softened, but his voice was firm. I'm sorry, Claire, but the truth is rarely as simple as we want it to be. I've spent hours going through everything I could find. And Luke? He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't just a marriage of love, it was a marriage of convenience, one that benefited both of them in ways you can't imagine. Claire felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had known. She had suspected that something didn't add up, but hearing it all laid out in front of her made the truth feel like a blow to the chest. Why didn't he tell me? Claire's voice broke slightly, the question barely audible. Ethan sat down across from her, his face softening. Luke didn't think he had to tell you, not after everything that happened. He assumed you would never understand, that you wouldn't want to be involved in this world. But he does care about you, Claire. I know that much. But it was easier for him to hide it all. Easier for him to protect the facade of his perfect life with Eleanor. A sharp ache formed in Claire's chest as she processed the truth. Everything had been a lie. The marriage, the child, the life she thought she had lost. It had all been a carefully orchestrated performance. And she had been a part of it, in her own way, but never truly allowed to be part of the bigger picture. For the first time in years, Claire felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump or turn back. But Ethan wasn't finished yet. There's one more thing. Thomas's biological father is involved in this deal as well. It's not just about Luke and Eleanor anymore. This is bigger than all of them, and I think... He paused, his voice lowering. I think it might even involve you. Claire's heart stopped. What do you mean? Ethan slid another document across the table. I'm not sure of all the details yet, but I think your father might have had a role in this too. There are some connections between his companies and the developers Luke and Eleanor are working with. I'm still tracing it all, but it's starting to look like your past is more tied up in this than you thought. Claire took the document from him, her hands shaking as she glanced at the names listed on it. Her father's name was there, along with several others she recognized from old business dealings, some long buried, some still active. Her mind raced, trying to piece it all together. The past she had spent so long running from was closing in on her once again, and this time there was no escaping it. Claire stood up, her legs unsteady as she faced the man who had been a constant in her life for so long. Ethan had opened the door, but Claire knew she had to walk through it. There was no turning back now. "I need time to think," Claire said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I need to figure out what this means for me, for my future." Ethan nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need, Claire, but know this, whatever you choose, you're not alone." As Claire walked out of Ethan's office, she felt the weight of the decisions ahead of her. The choices she would make would shape everything: her career, her future, and the life she thought she could leave behind. But one thing was clear: the truth had come crashing down, and now she would have to rebuild from the wreckage. Claire sat in her sleek black car, the leather seats cool beneath her. Her mind felt like it was spiraling, the revelations from Ethan still swirling in her thoughts. She had always been in control of her own life, determined, focused, and strategic. But now everything was unraveling. The web of lies that had surrounded her was far more tangled than she had imagined, and she had no idea how deep it really went. She glanced at the address on the phone screen, her fingers hovering over the contact list. She had been avoiding this for days, but now she couldn't deny it anymore. She had to talk to him. Luke. The name hung in the air, thick with emotion. There was a part of her that still wanted answers from him, that wanted to confront him and demand to know the truth. But there was another part of her, one that was reluctant to face him after everything that had been revealed. Could she even trust anything he said anymore? But she couldn't shake the thought that kept pulling at her. The boy. Thomas. The child who looked so much like Luke, the child who had been used as part of a business deal. Claire's heart ached for him. He was a victim in this, just like she had been. Claire took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was about to come. She needed closure. She needed to know if Luke had been as complicit in the web of lies as Ethan's investigation suggested. The elevator ride up to Luke's penthouse felt interminable. The familiar, polished interior of the building was cold, distant, like everything that had once felt like home to her. Claire's pulse quickened as the elevator doors opened, revealing the entrance to Luke's apartment. The same apartment she had spent so many nights in, a place that had once been filled with warmth and love. Now it seemed just as empty as the life they had shared. She rang the doorbell, her fingers shaking slightly. After a long moment, the door swung open, revealing Luke, dressed casually in jeans and a white shirt. His appearance was more relaxed than she expected, but the moment their eyes met, the tension between them was palpable. "Claire," Luke said softly, his voice betraying a hint of surprise. "I didn't expect you to come here." Claire took a deep breath, pushing aside the emotional turmoil that surged inside her. "I needed to talk to you," she said, her voice steady, but her heart pounding. "I don't know where to begin, Luke. I don't even know if I'm ready for this conversation. But I need answers." Luke's expression shifted. Something between guilt and confusion flickered across his face. He stepped back, gesturing for her to come in. "Please," he said quietly, "come inside." As she stepped into the apartment, Claire couldn't help but notice how everything seemed so pristine, so carefully arranged. It was a far cry from the life they had once shared, one full of spontaneity, laughter, and the kind of mess that came with love. "Sit down," Luke said, gesturing toward the couch. "I know you have questions, Claire, and I want to answer them. But He paused, running a hand through his hair, his eyes avoiding hers for a moment. "I don't know how to start." Claire's gaze softened, but the bitterness in her chest was still there. "Start with the truth," she said firmly, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "Start with Thomas." I need to know what's going on with him." Luke looked up at her then, his expression strained. "Thomas." He trailed off, taking a deep breath. "Claire, I never meant for this to happen. I never meant for you to get involved in all of this. But I've made decisions that were about more than just me. I was trying to protect everyone I love, including you." Claire's heart clenched at his words, but the pain in her chest only deepened. "Protect me?" she echoed, her voice shaking. "You've been lying to me, Luke. You didn't tell me about Thomas. You didn't tell me about the business deals, the marriage. It was all just a game, wasn't it? A way to secure your position, your future." Luke stood up and walked over to the large window, staring out at the city below. He looked like a man caught between two worlds, as though he was struggling to reconcile the man he had become with the one he used to be. "I didn't want to hurt you, Claire," he said softly. "When we were together, I thought I could have it all, us and the career I was building. But I didn't understand what that would cost. I didn't understand what it would cost you." Claire's chest tightened. "What is this, Luke? You're telling me now, after all these years, that you didn't realize what we had? That you didn't understand the sacrifice it took to make this work?" She paused, her voice trembling with emotion. "I gave up everything for you, for us, and now all I see is a lie." Luke's shoulders slumped, and for a moment he seemed like a man broken, haunted by his own choices. "You were everything to me, Claire, but I was too focused on my own success. I thought I could have both. I thought I could have you and everything else. Eleanor, the business, the image. I was wrong. I see that now." Claire stood up, her mind racing. She needed to know more, needed to dig deeper. "Tell me about Eleanor," she said, her voice steady but insistent. "What's really going on between you two? Is it just about Thomas? Is it about the business deal? Or is there something more?" Luke's eyes flickered toward her, a flash of guilt crossing his features. "Eleanor." He sighed. "It was never about love, Claire. At least, not the way you and I understood it. It was about survival. It was about making sure that both our worlds aligned, that we could secure our futures. We didn't have the same kind of love that we had. We never did." Claire stood there, taking it all in. The truth felt like a knife, sharp and brutal. The love she had once believed was real had been nothing more than a facade, built on ambition and power. "You were right about one thing," Luke said quietly, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "It wasn't love, but I still loved you. I always have." Claire's heart twisted at his words. She had wanted to believe in them, had wanted to believe that there was something left, something real between them. But now, she realized, the past was never as simple as she had imagined. It was a web of lies, of choices that had been made without her, and of a future that never included her in the way she had hoped. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was suffocating, but it was also the beginning of something new. Claire had come here for answers, but what she had found was something far deeper, a chance to walk away, to reclaim the life she had lost in pursuit of a dream that had never been hers to begin with. Finally, Claire turned toward the door. "I don't know what I expected, Luke," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "But I know now that I can't keep holding on to this. Whatever it was, it's over. I'm walking away." As the door clicked shut behind her, Claire felt a strange sense of finality settle in her chest. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know where the road ahead would lead, but for the first time in years, she was ready to step into a future of her own making. Claire stood outside the building, the city lights blurring as her mind raced. Her meeting with Luke had left her raw, her heart exposed to a painful truth that she had fought so hard to avoid. As she walked toward her car, The weight of everything that had unfolded pressed down on her, suffocating her. She had come here for answers, but all she had gotten was more confusion, more questions than before. Her phone buzzed again. The text was from Zoe. "How are you?" "I'm worried. Call me when you can." Claire hesitated for a moment before typing back. "I'm fine. I'll be home soon." She didn't want to burden Zoe with the full extent of what had happened. How could she explain? How could she articulate the swirling mess of emotions, betrayal, anger, disappointment, that filled her chest every time she thought about Luke, about the life he had built without her? It wasn't just about the business deals or the lies or even Thomas. It was about the woman she had been before all of this, the woman who had believed in love, in connection, in the possibility of something more. It was as if that version of herself had been erased, discarded like an old manuscript. Claire sank into the plush seat of her car, gripping the steering wheel. The familiar hum of the engine filled the space around her, but it did little to calm her nerves. As she navigated the streets back to her penthouse, her thoughts returned to the conversation she had had with Luke. His words echoed in her mind. "I still loved you. I always have." How could he still love her after everything that had happened? After all the secrets, all the lies? After he had married another woman, had built a life with someone else, while Claire had spent her time chasing power and success, believing that was all she needed. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a call. Claire didn't even need to check the number to know it was Ethan. "Claire," he said as soon as she picked up, his voice tinged with urgency. "I found something else. Something important." She pulled into her parking spot and put the car in park, the words catching her attention more than they should have. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice taut with a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. "Luke isn't the only one hiding things," Ethan replied. "I've been digging into the financial records of his business dealings, and I found a connection between him and your father's company. The one you thought was long gone from your life." Claire's pulse quickened. "What? What do you mean?" "I mean there's something here, Claire. Something bigger than I thought. Your father's name is linked to the same developers Luke's been working with. But it gets worse. There's a financial transaction I can't explain. Some sort of deal made just before your father passed away. The same group that's behind Luke's development project. Your father's estate has a stake in it." Her mind raced, trying to connect the dots. "You're saying my father?" Claire's voice trailed off as she struggled to absorb the weight of what Ethan was telling her. "Not just your father," Ethan continued. "There are indications that the deal your father was involved in could have been manipulated to benefit Luke and Eleanor. They might have known about the project long before you did." Claire's heart dropped into her stomach. Her father. The man who had been her idol. The person she had trusted more than anyone. To think that the very foundation of her life, of her wealth, could have been built on deceit was too much to bear. She had spent years believing she could separate herself from her father's legacy, but now it seemed impossible. Everything, her business, her success, the life she had built, was tied to the same lies. "I need to see this," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know everything." "I'll send it over," Ethan replied. "But Claire, be careful. If this is as deep as it seems, you're not just dealing with Luke anymore. You're dealing with a much bigger conspiracy." Claire stared at the screen of her phone, her heart pounding. This was it. This was the reckoning she had been avoiding. The truth was no longer a distant concept. It was right in front of her, waiting to shatter everything she had ever known. Hours later, Claire sat alone in her penthouse, surrounded by the documents Ethan had sent her. Her eyes scanned the pages, each word cutting deeper into her already fragile sense of reality. There it was, the financial transaction. The deal her father had made, signed just months before his death, linking him to the very same developers Luke and Eleanor had been working with. But what truly took her breath away was the final piece of the puzzle. The developer's name was one Claire had seen before, a name that had been associated with the political landscape of Chicago. The same network of power players her father had navigated for years. The connection was clear now. It wasn't just about real estate. It wasn't just about a business deal. It was about something much bigger, a game of power, influence, and manipulation. And Claire had been a pawn in that game, just as much as Luke, just as much as Thomas. She rubbed her eyes, trying to focus. The walls around her seemed to close in as she realized how entangled she was in this mess. Her father had been part of a web she hadn't even seen, and now Luke and Eleanor were at the heart of it. What did this mean for her? What did this mean for everything she had built? The answer was clear. She couldn't keep pretending she didn't have a stake in this. She had to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Her father's legacy, Luke's betrayal, and her own role in all of it. There was no way to walk away from it. But what if there was a way forward? The sound of her phone vibrating broke her from her thoughts, and she glanced down to see Zoe's name flashing on the screen. Claire had been avoiding her calls, unsure of what to say after everything that had happened. But now she couldn't ignore it any longer. Taking a deep breath, Claire swiped to answer. "Zoe?" "Claire," Zoe said, her voice filled with concern. "I've been trying to reach you. Are you okay?" Claire felt the weight of her own exhaustion, of the emotional toll the past few days had taken. "I don't know," she said, her voice shaking for the first time in days. "I don't know if I'll ever be okay." Zoe's silence was filled with empathy. "I'm here, Claire. Whatever happens, you don't have to go through this alone." The words hit Claire harder than she expected. In the midst of the lies and betrayals, in the midst of everything she had uncovered, Zoe's unwavering support was the one thing that still felt real. For the first time in what felt like forever, Claire allowed herself to lean into that support. "I'm so sorry, Zoe," Claire said, her voice cracking. "I've been shutting everyone out. I don't know how to fix any of this." Zoe's response was quiet, but it was filled with conviction. "You don't have to fix it, Claire. You just have to face it. And I'll be right here with you." For the first time in days, Claire allowed herself to breathe. Whatever the future held, whatever the truth revealed, she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't alone. The following morning, Claire woke to the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the sheer curtains in her penthouse. The city outside seemed unchanged, bustling, alive, as it always had been. But inside, everything felt different. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The truth about Luke, the secrets about her father's dealings, the tangled web that connected her past and present. It was all more than she had ever imagined. She had been holding on to a fragile version of reality, and now it had shattered into pieces she wasn't sure she could put back together. Her phone buzzed again, but this time Claire hesitated before reaching for it. She had been avoiding Luke's calls all morning, not sure what to say or how to face him after everything that had come to light. She knew the conversation had to happen, but she wasn't ready. She'd thought she could handle this on her own, keep her emotions in check, but now, with the truth so raw and everything so uncertain, she didn't know if she could go through it alone. Not anymore. She glanced down at the screen, where Zoe's name flashed, and answered. "Claire?" Zoe's voice was soft but insistent. "I've been worried. I need you to listen to me. I know you're feeling everything right now, but I think you need to make a choice. This whole situation with Luke, with your father, it's like you're holding your breath, waiting for something to happen. but nothing's going to change unless you decide what you want from all of this." Claire sighed, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I don't even know where to start, Zoe. It's like I've been living in a house of mirrors. I can't tell what's real anymore." Zoe was quiet for a moment. "I get it, Claire. But you can choose what comes next. You don't have to keep going around in circles. You have control of your future. And you can still decide who you want to be in all of this. But you can't keep letting them shape your story." Claire sat up straighter, Zoe's words sinking in. She had control of her future. It was something she had forgotten, something she had put on hold for too long while chasing a life that wasn't hers. "Okay," Claire said, a quiet determination settling over her. "I need to see Luke. I have to hear it from him. But I'm not going into this blindly anymore. This time, I'm in control." The meeting was set for that afternoon. Claire stood in front of her mirror, staring at her reflection, trying to summon the strength she would need. She dressed in a simple, elegant black dress. Nothing extravagant, but enough to reflect the new clarity she felt in herself. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, the lines of her face more defined than usual. She looked at herself, really looked at herself, and for the first time in days, she didn't just see a woman who had been betrayed and hurt. She saw someone who could take the reins of her own life again. The drive to Luke's apartment was short, but it felt like an eternity. Claire couldn't push the thoughts of Thomas, of Eleanor, of her father's legacy out of her head. Everything seemed tangled together now. Her past, her present, and the future that was waiting for her. The future that she hadn't yet chosen. When she arrived, Luke was already waiting for her at the door, his expression unreadable, his posture tense. There was a heaviness between them that neither of them knew how to dissolve. But Claire wasn't going to waste any more time on pleasantries. "Let's talk," Claire said, her voice firm. She stepped past him, into the familiar space that had once felt like home. Luke closed the door behind them and followed her inside. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night, Claire," he began. "And I understand why you're angry. But I need you to understand that this wasn't about hurting you. It never was." Claire turned to face him, her heart racing, but her eyes unwavering. "I've heard enough about intentions, Luke. I don't care about why you did it. I care about what you did, and you can't just gloss over it with excuses." Luke's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "I'm not trying to make excuses. But everything I've done, everything I've built, it's been about survival. For me, for Thomas, for us. This whole thing, it's been complicated, Claire." The words hung in the air, their weight heavy and suffocating. Claire took a step forward, meeting his gaze with an intensity that surprised even her. "Complicated? What about it has been complicated, Luke? You lied to me. You built a life with her and you used me as a pawn in your game. And then you expect me to just walk back into your world? To pretend that everything's fine?" Luke looked away, his frustration palpable. "I didn't want it to be like this," he said, his voice softer now. "I never wanted you to find out this way, Claire. You were always more than just part of the plan. But Eleanor, she's a part of this world now. And Thomas needs stability. He needs a future." Claire's chest tightened, her mind reeling with the realization. "You're still thinking about Thomas, aren't you?" she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You've always been about securing things, your business, your reputation, your family. But in the end, Luke, all that's left is a string of broken promises, and I can't be a part of that anymore." Luke's expression shifted, his face softening, as though her words had finally reached him. He took a step toward her, but Claire held up a hand, stopping him. "No," she said, her voice firm. "Don't. I need to hear the truth, Luke. I need to know what happened with Thomas. What role did I really play in your life? What role does he play in this?" Luke paused, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of everything he had been holding on to finally started to crack. "I don't know, Claire. I don't know what any of it means anymore. I got lost in the idea of having it all, and now I don't know how to get out of it." Claire took a deep breath, her mind clearer than it had been in days. She realized in that moment that she could never move forward with Luke, never trust him the way she had once believed she could. But there was something she could do. "I've spent too much of my life chasing something that wasn't real," Claire said softly, her voice breaking. "And I can't keep doing that. I need to move forward, Luke, but I need to do it on my own." Luke didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I understand, Claire. I always knew this day would come. I just didn't want to face it." Claire nodded, a sense of finality settling over her. "Then I guess we're both facing it now." As she turned to leave, she felt something inside her release, a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying. She was done holding on to the past, done holding on to a future that had never been hers to begin with. For the first time in a long time, Claire felt free. And with that freedom came a new sense of purpose. She didn't need Luke's approval, his forgiveness, or his love. She needed to love herself first. And that was the only future that mattered now. Claire's footsteps echoed through the quiet halls of her penthouse as she made her way to the large glass windows overlooking the city. The skyline stretched out before her, a vast expanse of glass and steel, each building a reminder of everything she had worked for, everything she had achieved. But now, standing here, with the weight of everything that had unfolded between her, Luke, and her father, she felt as though the glass walls around her were closing in, trapping her in a life she no longer recognized. She wasn't sure how much time had passed since her meeting with Luke. It felt like a lifetime, but in truth, it had only been a few hours. He had confessed everything, about his marriage to Eleanor, about the manipulation behind it, and about Thomas. She had expected some kind of clarity, some sense of closure. But instead, it felt like she was standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure of which way to turn. The truth had shattered her carefully constructed world, but there was something else lingering beneath the surface. A quiet, stubborn hope. Hope that she could rebuild. Hope that she could move beyond this. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking her reverie. It was a message from Zoe. "You good? I'm worried about you. Call me when you can." Claire stared at the screen for a moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She knew Zoe had been there for her every step of the way, ever since the beginning, when Claire had buried herself in work and pretended that her personal life didn't matter. But now, Zoe's message felt like a lifeline. She didn't have to face this alone anymore. "I'm okay. I'll call you in a bit." As Claire set her phone down, she glanced back at the city below. She had never felt so disconnected from everything that had once driven her. The empire, the business deals, the endless meetings. It all felt like a mask she could no longer wear. The knock at the door startled her, pulling her out of her thoughts. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone, but there was only one person who could still have access to her, who could step into her world without permission. Luke. Her first instinct was to ignore the knock, to shut herself off completely. But deep down, she knew she wasn't ready to let go of this final confrontation. She wasn't ready to let the pieces of her past slip away without a final understanding. Claire took a deep breath and walked to the door, her fingers brushing over the polished wood of the handle. She opened it to find Luke standing there, looking hesitant but determined. His eyes were tired, as though he hadn't slept since their conversation earlier that day. "Claire," he said softly, his voice a mix of apology and longing. "Can we talk?" Her heart twisted. She didn't want to face him. Not right now, not after everything that had been said. But there was a part of her, the part that had once loved him, that needed to hear him out. "Come in," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him pass. He walked in, glancing around the apartment as though seeing it for the first time. It wasn't the luxury or the grandiosity that caught his attention. It was the emptiness that had taken root within her since everything had started unraveling. She could feel it between them, the unspoken distance, the walls they'd built around each other. Luke took a seat on the couch, his hands resting in his lap, fingers twitching nervously. He was still the man she had once known, the man who had made her feel like she was the center of his world. But now he was a stranger, a man who had hidden so many truths from her, a man whose life was built on deceit. "I don't know what I'm doing here, Claire," he said, his voice low, almost defeated. "I never meant to hurt you, and I don't know if you'll ever believe me. But I wish I could undo everything. I wish I could go back and make different choices. But I can't. I can't change the past." Claire felt the knot in her stomach tighten. She was so tired of hearing about regrets. Regrets weren't enough anymore. She had lived with them for too long, living in the shadow of what she had sacrificed for the man sitting across from her, for the life that she had built on the idea of love and partnership. But all of it had been a lie. "You can't undo the past, Luke," Claire replied, her voice firm, though it cracked with emotion. "But you can be honest with me now. For once, just be honest with me." Luke looked up at her, his eyes searching hers, as though looking for something, an answer, forgiveness, redemption. "I never wanted this life, Claire. I never wanted to be the man who built his world on lies. But when I looked at you, I saw someone who could give me everything I wanted, someone who could make everything real. But I didn't know how to balance it all. I didn't know how to love you and keep my empire intact. And then, when you pulled away, I felt like I was losing everything." He paused, swallowing hard. "I thought if I just kept pushing, kept building, that maybe I could make it all work. But I was wrong." Claire's heart twisted as she listened to him speak. She knew the pain in his voice wasn't fake. She knew he was still grappling with everything that had gone wrong. But the reality was clearer than ever. They were both so lost in their own worlds, their own ambitions, that they had stopped seeing each other. "I was wrong too," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could fix everything. I thought I could change who I was for you. But I didn't change. I just lost myself." Luke reached across the space between them, his hand hovering over hers but not quite touching. "You haven't lost yourself, Claire. You're stronger than that. You're more than you think. And maybe we both need to let go of who we were and figure out who we are now." Claire looked at him, her heart torn between the desire to let him in, to believe in the possibility of something real, and the overwhelming need to protect herself from the pain. The past was a chapter she couldn't rewrite, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was a future beyond it. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Luke," she said softly. "I don't know if I can trust myself to make the right decisions anymore." He didn't pull away, and for the first time since their meeting earlier that day, there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Then maybe we take it slow. Maybe we start with being honest, with being real. I can't undo what happened, but I can be here now. I'll always be here for you, Claire. You don't have to walk through this alone." Claire felt the weight of his words settle heavily on her shoulders. She didn't know if she was ready to let him back into her life. But one thing was clear. She was no longer afraid to walk away from the past. The future was hers to shape, and it started now. As she sat there, facing Luke, facing the man who had once been her everything, Claire knew that this was only the beginning. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of something inside her. It was time to start living for herself again. Time to rebuild. The days following her conversation with Luke felt like a quiet reprieve, a pause in the chaos that had dominated Claire's life for so long. The weight of everything that had happened, the lies, the secrets, the broken pieces of her heart, had not vanished. But for the first time in a long while, Claire felt a flicker of hope. She was beginning to understand that her life, her future, wasn't defined by the man sitting across from her or the business deals that had entangled her family's name. It was something she could create for herself, something that had always been within her reach, but had been buried beneath years of expectations and hidden truths. Claire stood at the windows of her penthouse, staring out at the familiar skyline, the soft hum of the city below grounding her thoughts. The view had always been one of comfort, a reminder of what she had built, what she had worked for. But now it felt like a symbol of possibility, not just of success, but of change. She had spent so many years obsessed with the idea of control, of maintaining the perfect image. But now, standing here, she knew that perfection was an illusion. And in that realization, Claire felt the first true spark of freedom. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, interrupting her reverie. It was a text from Zoe. "I need to see you. Let me know when you're free." The words sent a small ripple of tension through Claire. She hadn't seen Zoe in person since the wedding, though they'd exchanged a few texts. Zoe had always been the steady presence in her life, the one who didn't expect anything from Claire, other than her honesty. But after the truth about Luke had come to light, Claire couldn't help but feel like there were things she still wasn't ready to talk about. Still, she knew that Zoe wouldn't give up until they talked, and Claire needed to reconnect with the one person who had stood by her through everything. "I'm free now. Come over." She didn't want to hide anymore. She wanted to face everything, even the things that scared her. And she knew Zoe would be the person who could help her do that. When Zoe arrived, it was clear from the moment she stepped through the door that Claire wasn't the only one holding something back. Zoe had always been perceptive, able to read Claire with a glance, and now she seemed to sense the quiet storm that still raged inside her. "You look different," Zoe said, her voice soft but observant. "I don't know if it's just the lighting, but you seem lighter, like you've made a decision." Claire hesitated before nodding, the truth of her words just beginning to form. "I've decided to stop holding on to the past, Zoe, to stop living in this constant state of regret and what-ifs. The truth is, I'm tired of trying to fit into a world that doesn't fit me anymore." Zoe sat down on the couch across from her, her expression unreadable. "That's a big step, Claire. What about Luke? What about Thomas?" Claire sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust Luke again, and I don't know what my place is in his life, or in Thomas's. But I can't keep pretending that I'm a part of something that was built on lies. I have to choose a life that's mine." Zoe nodded, her eyes softening with understanding. "You know I've always been here for you, right? Whatever you choose. But I also know that you've been carrying around the weight of this for so long. Luke, your father, everything. I think you're ready to let it go." Claire smiled, a little ruefully. "I hope so. But it's not just about letting go. It's about what I choose to do next. And I need to make sure that I'm doing it for the right reasons." The silence between them was comfortable, but it was also full of unspoken things. Zoe had always been the type to offer Claire a safe space to think. But today, Claire knew Zoe was waiting for her to say the next thing, the thing that would set her free. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice quieter this time. "I've decided to take some time off, just to figure out who I am outside of everything that has defined me. The business, the expectations, the image. I need to rediscover what I want, what I truly want, without all the noise." Zoe's eyes softened, and she leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Claire, that's huge, and I think it's the right decision. You've been running for so long, trying to outrun your past, trying to outrun the pain of all the things that went wrong. But this time, you're not running. You're just choosing yourself, and that's the most powerful thing you can do." Claire swallowed, a lump in her throat as Zoe's words sunk in. It wasn't just the life she had been living. It was the person she had been becoming. She had been so caught up in trying to fix everything that she had forgotten to nurture the parts of herself that mattered most. She wasn't just a businesswoman or a daughter. She was a woman who deserved to be loved, who deserved to feel whole, who deserved to choose what came next. "I'm scared," Claire admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what comes next, and I don't know if I can handle the unknown. But I know I need to face it. I can't keep hiding behind my success or the story I've been telling myself for years." Zoe smiled, her eyes warm with affection. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. You just need to start walking, one step at a time. And when you need a hand, I'll be here." Claire nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in months, the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. She wasn't doing this alone. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Later that evening, Claire found herself sitting at her desk, the papers from Ethan scattered in front of her. There was still so much work to be done. There were decisions to make about the company, about her future. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't overwhelmed by it. She wasn't running from it. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was moving forward on her own terms. And that, more than anything, was enough. As the city lights flickered in the distance, Claire closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself a rare moment of peace. She didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, she was ready to find out. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Claire. She had stepped back from the day-to-day grind of her business, taking the time to sort through her feelings, her past, and, most importantly, her future. It wasn't easy. Some days the weight of uncertainty crushed her. She had spent so long being defined by her success, by the image she had crafted, that now, without those things, she wasn't sure who she really was. But there were other days, rare and fleeting, when a sense of peace washed over her. Days when she felt hopeful again. Days when she allowed herself to imagine a future where she was free, not just from her old life, but from the expectations that had always governed her. Today, though, she wasn't feeling peaceful. She stood in front of her full-length mirror, adjusting the hem of her navy dress. It was elegant, understated, a reflection of how she wanted to be, calm, controlled, confident. She wasn't sure how much of that she actually felt, but she was determined to try. Her phone buzzed on the counter next to her, and she glanced down to see a text from Zoe. "Meeting with the new investors at 2? Don't back out now, Claire. You're ready for this." She smiled despite herself. Zoe had been pushing her to get back to her work, to show up and remind herself of the woman she had been before everything had unraveled. And while Claire had resisted at first, she realized that Zoe was right. She couldn't keep avoiding it forever. She needed to reclaim the parts of her life that had once been so important to her, her career, her sense of purpose. But as she finished getting ready and prepared for the meeting, another message pinged on her phone. This one wasn't from Zoe, It was from Luke. "Can we talk?" Claire's breath caught in her throat as she read the words. She hadn't heard from him since their conversation weeks ago. Since then, he'd sent a few messages, but she had ignored them all. She had needed space, needed time to heal, to figure out who she was without the shadows of their past hanging over her. But now, here he was again, reaching out. And for some reason, she couldn't ignore the pull to respond. She had told herself that she was done with him, that their story had ended, that it was time for her to move on. But even after everything, she still couldn't shake the remnants of the feelings they had shared. "I'm meeting with some investors today. Can we talk later?" Claire typed the message quickly, her fingers trembling slightly. She wasn't sure why she felt so unsure about it all. She had made peace with her decision to leave Luke behind. But now, with his message in front of her, everything seemed more complicated. A moment later, she received his reply. "I understand. But please, whenever you're ready." Claire stared at the screen for a moment longer before setting the phone down. She had a meeting to get to. But deep down, she knew that the conversation with Luke would have to happen soon. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but one thing was certain. She couldn't avoid it forever. The meeting went better than Claire had expected. Zoe was right. She had missed the world of business, the thrill of negotiation, the sense of accomplishment that came with closing a deal. But as the hours wore on and the deal was sealed, Claire couldn't shake the lingering feeling in her chest. It was as if something, or someone, was pulling at her from the other side. She stood on the rooftop of her office building as the sun set over the city, the warm, golden light reflecting off the skyscrapers, casting long shadows across the streets below. Claire closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, letting the evening air wash over her. "Enjoying the view?" The voice startled her. Claire spun around, her heart leaping into her throat as she found herself face to face with Luke. He was standing just a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, looking as unruffled as ever. But there was something in his eyes now, something vulnerable, something real. "Luke," Claire said, her voice a mixture of surprise and wariness. She hadn't expected him to show up here, not today, not after everything. He nodded, taking a step closer, his gaze softening. "I didn't want to invade your space, I just—" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, looking conflicted. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything, about how I left things, and I need you to know, Claire, that I've made a mess of everything. But that doesn't change the fact that I still care about you. I still love you." Claire's heart twisted at his words, but she steadied herself, shaking her head slightly. "You don't get to just say that, Luke. Not after everything that's happened, after everything you did. You can't just walk back into my life and expect me to fall into step with you again. I've spent too long holding on to something that was never real." Luke's eyes darkened at her words, and he stepped forward, his expression earnest. "I know I've made mistakes, Claire, but I don't want to keep running from this, from you. I've been hiding behind my wealth, my business, all of it, thinking that success could fix everything. But the truth is, I was running from myself, running from the one thing that really mattered, and that's you." Claire's chest tightened. She had come so far from the woman who had once desperately clung to him, to their love, to their idea of a future. She had spent so many years letting her emotions cloud her judgment, but now she was standing here, stronger, clearer, ready to face the truth. "I've been running too," Claire said softly. "But I'm done with that. I need to find out who I am without all of this, without you. I can't keep being part of something that's built on lies." Luke's face tightened, his jaw clenching. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Claire. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I need you to know what I've built, everything I've done, None of it means anything if I don't have you in my life." Claire took a deep breath, staring out at the city. She could feel the weight of his words, but she knew something now that she hadn't known before. She could love him, but she couldn't lose herself in him again. "I need to take care of myself first, Luke," she said, her voice strong, though the sadness in her eyes was undeniable. "I can't keep living in the past, in a world where I'm not being true to who I am." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was thick, charged, but Claire knew deep down that it was the right decision. It was the first time in years that she was making a choice for herself, not for someone else. Luke nodded, his face softening with a quiet understanding. "I can't change the past, Claire, but I'm here, whenever you're ready. If you ever need me." Claire gave him a small, bittersweet smile, and without another word she turned and walked back inside. The door closed softly behind her, and for the first time in a long time, Claire felt the weight of the future, not as a burden, but as a promise, one she was finally ready to keep for herself. Claire stood on the balcony of her penthouse, the early morning light stretching across the city like a promise. The air was cool, crisp with the anticipation of something new. She had spent so much of her life looking outward, chasing success, building empires, and creating an image that the world would admire. But now, as the sun rose over the skyline, she realized that she had been ignoring the most important thing of all. The person she was becoming, the life she wanted to build for herself. A few months ago, she would have been preoccupied with meetings, phone calls, the endless demands of the company she had created. But today she stood still, breathing in the calm, letting the silence surround her. It was a foreign feeling, one that she had almost forgotten, but it was exactly what she needed. Luke's words from their last meeting still lingered in her mind, though the sting they once held had faded. He had apologized, more times than she could count, and while part of her still carried the weight of his betrayal, Claire had come to realize that forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for her. She had needed to forgive herself for allowing herself to get lost in his world, for sacrificing parts of herself in the name of love. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She turned from the balcony and walked back into the apartment, the sunlight streaming through the glass. The space felt different now, less like a cage, more like a sanctuary. Over the past few weeks, she had begun making small changes, taking on projects she was passionate about, spending more time with friends, reconnecting with old hobbies. She wasn't running anymore, not from herself or anyone else. Her phone buzzed on the table, and for a moment Claire hesitated. She had been so careful to guard her space, her emotions. But when she saw Zoe's name flash across the screen, she couldn't ignore it. "You good?" Claire smiled softly at the simplicity of the message. Zoe had been her constant, her anchor, through every storm. And Claire knew now that she didn't have to face the world alone. "I'm more than good. I'm figuring it out." She typed back, feeling the weight of those words settle in her chest. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the doubts crept back in. But Claire had learned to push through them, to step forward even when she wasn't sure what the next step would look like. She put the phone down and walked over to the window, watching as the city below her came to life. There was a new energy in her now, one she hadn't felt in years. It was a quiet power, not the kind that came with board meetings or multi-million-dollar deals, but the kind that came from knowing who you were and what you were capable of. A soft knock on the door broke her concentration. She had been expecting it, but still, her heart skipped a beat as she walked over and opened it. "Hi," Luke said, standing there, his hands in his pockets, a tentative smile on his face. He looked different, too, his usual polished demeanor softened, the weight of everything that had happened between them clear in his eyes. "Hi," Claire replied, her voice steady but warm. She wasn't sure where this conversation would go, but for the first time she didn't feel the same fear she had when they'd first met. She had made peace with their past. She had made peace with herself. Luke cleared his throat, stepping inside as Claire stepped back. He looked around the apartment, his gaze lingering on the changes she had made. "This place, it's different," he said, the words hanging in the air between them. "It is," Claire agreed, walking over to the couch and sitting down. "It's mine now." Luke nodded, a hint of understanding in his eyes. "I'm glad," he said softly. "I never wanted to take that away from you. I didn't know how to be the person you needed me to be. I don't know if I ever will." Claire smiled, a small but genuine smile. "You've taught me a lot, Luke. But I've learned that I don't need to be anyone for you, or for anyone. Not anymore. I'm learning how to just be me." Luke's expression softened, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and admiration. "I don't expect anything from you, Claire. I want you to be happy." "I am," Claire said, her voice steady. "But I'm not sure that happiness looks the same as it used to. It's not about the things anymore, not about the wealth or the empire or the expectations. It's about living for the right reasons, for my reasons." Luke took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "So what happens now?" Claire took a deep breath, her heart steady in her chest. "What happens now is that we both move forward. We both figure out who we are without the shadows of the past. You can keep your empire, but I'm taking my life back." Luke nodded, his eyes searching hers. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, a quiet understanding settling in. He didn't need her to save him. She didn't need him to fix everything. They were two people who had been through the fire, and now they were standing on the other side, separate, but stronger. "I respect that," Luke said, his voice low. "I'll always respect you, Claire. I just hope you find everything you're looking for." Claire smiled, this time with more certainty. "I will, and so will you." Luke turned to leave, but before he stepped out the door, he paused and turned back to her. "You've always been incredible, Claire. I hope you know that." Claire's heart softened, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't expected. Peace. "Thank you, Luke. I hope you find peace, too." As the door clicked shut behind him, Claire stood there for a moment, absorbing the weight of everything that had just passed. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into his life all those years ago. She had grown, evolved, and learned how to love herself. The city outside seemed to hum with life as Claire turned back to the window. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time she was excited for it. She was ready to create a life that was truly hers, a life that she could build from the ground up, without the constraints of anyone else's expectations. The horizon before her was wide, full of endless possibilities, and Claire was ready to embrace every single one of them